problem that you're going to have is any criteria you would use to try to discredit the Bible could also be used to discredit everything we know about history. There's more evidence to support that Jesus was who he says he was than there is for George Washington. Or like I like to point out, you know how many documents say that your mother is your mother? 1. You guys go home for Thanksgiving and hold it up to the light. Like, Mom, I'm gonna need some supporting documentation here. You got any other eyewitness accounts? Anybody else who can attest to this being true? Good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing? Well, we are rapidly approaching the end of our summer and getting into another school year. I don't know if that's good or bad, if you got young kids or not. We don't send our kids to school. We just let them grow up in the woods. But one of the issues with coming up on the school year is, it's kind of nice. You're getting a break from your kids, but you got to let them go back out into the world. And there's a reason why, as we're going through this whole Exodus series about freedom, Pastor Josh, in his wisdom, wanted to put freedom from doubt, this message we're going to be talking about today, but it right up against the end of summer and the beginning of the school year. We're all going to get back out there in the real world around friends and family. Summer vacation time is over, and we're going to be interacting with the real world. And how many of you guys know, you either have kids in school or you've been to school, modern day schools can be somewhat of like doubt factories, right? They can produce a lot of doubt. In fact, I heard it said the other day, and I really like this, schools have kind of abandoned teaching how to think and use logic. Instead of teaching kids how to think, they just teach them what to feel. And then they just send them out in the world with a bunch of feelings. And the problem with when you don't know how to think is you're still burdened as a human being with processing information. So if I don't know how to think, but I still have to process information, what does that leave me with? Just emotional processing. And so everybody's believing what they believe because it just feels right or it feels good. You guys might remember last month I mentioned that all of us human beings believe that we're in a story, that we have to, that there's some great narrative associated with our experience as human beings. This is what can often be referred to as a worldview. And without this story and some type of guiding ethic or principle to live by, you wouldn't even be able to process data, prioritize actions, or move through life in any meaningful way at all. Our worldview is like a pair of glasses that you put on. And you see the world through these glasses. And there's many different worldviews held by many different people. And this is how we can often look at the same things and come to much different conclusions because of our presumptive worldview glasses. However, the thing about worldviews is they're all distinct from one another. And by definition, if it's distinct, then that means that they're not exactly the same. So if one worldview can be proven to be most true, then by definition, it means the other worldviews are not true. And so that's what we're going to try to do today. I'm going to compare two distinct worldviews that we've all had to deal with and interact with in our modern day American lives. Now, one of these worldviews I believe to be true. I believe that this worldview gives peace, that it gives purpose, and that it gives hope. And the other worldview, I believe, sows doubt and sows deception and actually robs us of peace, purpose, and hope. And we're going to consider these two worldviews, but when we do it, we're going to keep in mind that we are not asking questions of mere possibility. What we are is asking questions of probability. Sure, in some academic setting with a whiteboard behind you, you could make an argument that anything is possible, sure. But that's not what we're interested in. We have to make a real decision, a determination about which one's true. So we need to know what's the most probable, what gives the best account for reality. So an analogy here, I want you to imagine you were to be a judge at a high school science fair. And when you walk into the room, your job is to determine which one of these models of planet Earth is the best model, is the most true model. Well, if you're going to be intellectually honest, when you walk in, you have to start out with a position of integrity. You have to start out and say, well, I'm not going to assume any one is better than the other. I'm going to assume that it's possible any one of them is the best. Well, then the question is, how do you determine which one is actually the best? Well, you're going to have to go and examine it. and explore it. And what you're looking for is which model makes the most sense and gives the best account for everything we know to be true about history, science, our own personal experience, the world around us. Which one can give the best account? And when you find that one, you'll give it the blue ribbon. And then by definition, that means it's the winner, which means all the other ones are losers, right? Or at least second best at best, right? Now I want you to imagine for a moment, instead of a high school science fair and instead of models of planet Earth, it's you sitting there, and you have to, on display is your worldview. Now, if I come to you and I ask you to explain to me your worldview, would you be able to do it? If I were to ask you to articulate what you believe, could you do that? Could you give me a reason? And those of you might be thinking, yes, if I were to ask you, okay, tell me what your worldview is, but I also want you to explain to me how it is you arrived at those conclusions. Would you be able to walk me through a reasonable explanation of why you believe what you believe? See, for every one of us as Christians, the answer to those questions ought to be yes. The Bible tells us, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. 1 Peter 3:15. However, I don't think that we've been as effective as maybe we ought to be as Christians at doing this. Frank Turek, a Christian apologist and author, often says, the reason why so many Christians are so easily talked out of the faith is because they were never talked into it. Nobody ever explained it to them in a way that made sense. Nobody ever showed them the evidence and the reason behind what they believe. Now, I'm not accusing anybody of not believing what they claim to believe. But what I'm saying is that when you don't know why what you believe to be true is true, well, then you leave room for doubt. And what doubt does is it makes room for deception. The Bible tells us that the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. James 1:6. So here's an interesting question. How would you be able to tell if you were being deceived or not? You wouldn't, right? By definition, if you're deceived, you don't know that you're deceived. So the only hope you could have is if you knew something to be true. And then you could determine if that thought is taking you closer to what you know to be true or further away. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that you're in a life raft, floating out in the open ocean, endless horizon all the way around you. There's no fixed star in the sky. There's no land mass on the horizon anywhere around you, just moving water and endless horizon. Let me ask you a question. How would you know if you were moving in the right direction or not? You wouldn't, right? How would you even know if you were moving at all? You wouldn't know. You see, it is imperative that we believe something to be true, that we have a fixed point on the horizon that can serve as a reference point and a guide for us. And we need to have confidence in that fixed point being true, so that then lies and doubt don't end up leading us into deception and hopelessness. In Genesis chapter 3, Eve has a very interesting conversation with Satan. Verses 1-5, it says, he said to the woman, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. I want you to notice something interesting about this conversation. Who initiates it? Satan initiates it, right? Which I find really interesting because I think intuitively as children, we even know this to be true, that there's always someone behind something. Children tend to ask questions like, Dad, who made that car? Mom, who made the butterfly? You know, it isn't until we grow older and then we start to entertain conversations with modern day serpents that we start to doubt that intuition. Right? First, what they do is they like to sow doubt, crack the door open just a little bit. And they'll do it by saying things like, maybe nobody made them. Maybe they simply popped into existence out of nothing. And maybe there is no intelligent design behind any of it, but rather just unintelligent, unguided, meaningless mutation. When they get you to start stumbling over those ideas and starting to doubt a little bit, well then, assuredly, the next thing coming is a lie. And the lie goes like this. Now, just because everything is ultimately meaningless, well, that doesn't mean that your life must be meaningless. Giving up your faith isn't going to hurt you. In fact, it will set you free from any and all moral obligations, and it will allow you to decide for yourself what is right and wrong. See, isn't the offer always the same? The offer is always choose pride over humility. It's always abandon God, and then you'll be free to become your own God. The problem with this lie is that it untethers you from reality, and it renders you a slave to your own desires and makes you only more susceptible to all future doubt and deception. Jesus tells us in John chapter 8, the truth will set you free, verse 32, and that everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin, verse 34. However, the best way to detect a lie is not by studying the lies. The best way to detect a lie is by studying the truth. Back in the day when we used to have paper money, you'd have to take that money to a bank and exchange it, put it into your bank accounts, things like that. Now, the bank tellers, they had to be able to tell real money from fake money. And so what they would do is they wouldn't study all the counterfeits because the counterfeits can be endless. Instead, what they would do is they would study the true dollar. They would study and fixate on that which was true, and the better they understood the truth, the more easily they could detect the lie when it came across their desks. So today, we are going to attempt to discern the truth about these two opposing worldviews. In the book of Exodus, God goes on to inflict 10 plagues on Egypt in order to free his people. But here's an interesting question. Why did it take God 10 attempts instead of only one? Did God fail 9 times prior? Or was God maybe up to something else entirely? See, I think that what God was up to was the systematic destruction of an evil worldview. Now, I don't have the time to walk through every one of these plagues, but I would encourage you to go and read Exodus chapters 7 through 11 to see if what we're pointing out here bears out to be true. Each of these plagues was a direct challenge to one of Pharaoh's gods. And God proved that each one of them was false and ultimately no match for the true God. And he concluded with his 10th and final plague, which was against the firstborn, where God ultimately proved to Pharaoh, who, by the way, he himself believed that he was divine, that even he only existed because God had allowed him to. And he also did this to prove to his people that he alone was God. In Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 and 3, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. A few weeks ago, I mentioned how I believe that the opposite of theism isn't even atheism. It's actually idolatry. And I believe that because all of us human beings have to have something to put our faith in. Otherwise, we can't orient and move our way through life. And when we don't want to put our faith in the true God, well, we just create idolatrous ones. And these idolatrous gods often only exist in order to serve us. So what does that mean? It means that often those who reject God are doing so merely so that they are able to live in service to themselves rather than in humility to God. I'll be honest, I've never once met an atheist who has logically reasoned their way to atheism. And I'm not surprised by this because according to the atheistic worldview, there is no such thing as reason. And there definitely isn't any ability to do reason. So it would make sense that all of their positions are devoid of logic and reason. However, every encounter that I've had with a self-described atheist always deduces down ultimately to them simply not wanting to believe. That's what it comes down to. They just don't want it to be true. So for us as Christians, trying to reach our atheist friends, we have to understand this key point. And that is that a lack of faith isn't a head problem, it's a heart problem. Their issue is not with the evidence, their issue is with the implications of the evidence. Because they have no problem believing in non-material or even in the miraculous. Their problem is with the notion of a God, because that would imply that they are not the ultimate moral authority over their own lives. If there is a God, well then that means they are not him. Frank Turek often uses a great question when he's dealing with kids on college campuses. He'll ask them, so, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And shockingly, most of the time, their answer is no, they wouldn't. You see, they would rather deny the truth than accept it and its implications. They would rather run from it. And I think these types of people are better described not as atheists, but rather anti-theists. They aren't on a truth quest. They're on a happiness quest. That's what they're looking for. They are simply repulsed by the notion of God, or as C.S. Lewis would put it, the inconvenient truth. Now, I want to clarify before we go forward what an atheist is and what an atheist isn't. Because often, many self-described atheists will say that, well, all atheism is a lack of belief. But that's not true. We already have a term for that, and that term is agnosticism. And what an agnostic is somebody who isn't sure. Agnostics are saying, I don't know, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. I could be convinced either way. An agnostic is making a doubt claim, right? But the atheist is making a truth claim because they're saying something different. They're saying there is no God, which is a claim to truth. Just like when we Christians say, I believe there is a God, that's a truth claim. And so you should ask me for evidence and arguments to support my claim. So I'll give you an analogy here. Imagine if I were to say, I believe there's diamonds on the moon. It would be reasonable for you to ask me, oh, interesting. What evidence and arguments do you have that would illustrate that that claim is true? And I should have to give you some. I should have to provide some. But if I were to say the opposite truth claim and say, I believe there are no diamonds on the moon, well, that's also a claim to truth. So I want to see your evidence and I want to see your arguments. If you want to take the middle road, then call yourself an agnostic and just go, I don't know, man. Maybe there's diamonds on the moon, maybe there isn't. Be honest, I haven't looked into it. I don't seem to care too much, right? But the takeaway for us with this is that as believers and apologists for the faith, maybe our approach with our atheist friends needs to be a little bit different than our approach with our agnostic friends. With our agnostic friends, maybe just simply the gospel and the evidence for the gospel would be enough. That if they would examine it with some intellectual honesty and look into the claims and reason their way through it, they may come to the right conclusion, just as we have, that there is a God and he is the God of the Bible. But we're dealing with something different when we're dealing with our atheist friends. I think what we may need to do is challenge the deceptive pseudo-intellectual barriers that are keeping them from considering the gospel or any of its evidence. So just as God went about challenging all of Pharaoh's false gods by dragging them out in the light and exposing them as being frauds in comparison to him, we Christians too should be in the habit of dragging these lies and deception out into the light to see if they can withhold the scrutiny of the truth. So what I want to do is a little exercise in that now. We'll see how it holds up. You know, many atheists, they'll claim that the reason that they cannot believe in God is simply because it's unscientific. Miracles are not possible. And all that exists is nature and its material and its unguided interactions with itself. However, none of that is true. They know that that isn't true. If they don't know that it isn't true, then they should. Many of our conclusions about God are derived precisely because of our application of the scientific method, of applying logical reasoning and using effect to cause rationale to make inferences to conclusions. So do not be deceived when they say something like this, because atheists do believe in miracles. And every one of them live their lives as if the non-physical reality is in fact real. And here's an example of 6 miracles that atheists believe, whether they know it or not. That something comes from nothing. That order comes from chaos. Life comes from non-life. Personal consciousness comes from non-personal material. Reason comes from non-reason. And our morality, well, it just comes from molecules. Now, I don't know about you guys, but those seem to be some pretty large, unscientific, miraculous claims that I think it takes an immense amount of faith to believe in. I mean, an amount of faith that we might be enviable of as Christians. But I think what we do too often is we allow our atheist friends to get off the hook. We allow them to just sit back, throw objections and criticisms at our worldview, all while we never hold their feet to the fire and make them justify theirs. I, for once, would like to hear an atheist lay out the affirmative case for atheism. Show me the evidence. Show me the arguments. I'd like to see them. Instead, what we get is a series of claims that are all ultimately self-defeating. But these claims are meant to sow doubt in our Christian worldview. So what is a self-defeating claim? Well, it's a claim that doesn't even live up to its own standards and ultimately contradicts itself. So here's an example. So I got a few examples here so we can see the flaw in this type of reasoning. They'll say something like, there is no objective truth, to which you should ask, well, is that true? Because if it's true that there is no truth, then the statement there is no truth cannot be true, right? So they'll say things, well, you Christians shouldn't judge. Oh, really? Well, why are you judging me for judging? Right? Isn't that a judgment that you're levying against me? The scientific method is the only way that you can know the truth. Oh, really? Did you use the scientific method to arrive at that truth? Or is that just a philosophical assertion that you're making? See, the problem with the scientific method is it is presupposed by both truth and logic. You can't do science without presupposing truth and logic exist. Therefore, you could never use science to prove or disprove truth or logic. It's an oxymoronic way of approaching it. One of my favorites is, you shouldn't impose your morality upon me. Aren't you imposing that morality on me when you're doing that? And one of the best ones here is when they say, I don't believe in free will. Instead, I believe in naturalistic determinism, to which you should ask, oh, interesting. Why did you choose to believe in that? Right? Or what they do is they have these like seemingly clever questions to try to paint us into a corner. An example of this is they'll go, well, all right, if God created the universe, then who created God? Which, if anybody above the 5th grade is asking you this, you gotta wonder where they went to school. See, because what's going on here is what's known as a category error. We Christians don't believe God was created. So asking us who created the uncreated is like asking me what the color blue tastes like or how much the letter C weighs. They're in completely different categories. So the questions in and of themselves are nonsensical. So what is it that we Christians claim to be true? Well, today I've got 3 arguments for us that I believe can prove God exists. I got 4 questions that if we answer yes to them, at least make the case that Christianity is at least possible. And then I got 1 unique claim about Christianity that I think will be the ultimate point here. But let's start with the arguments. The first argument is the Kalam cosmological argument, or the uncaused cause argument. And it goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, a cause for the universe must exist. You see, science has consistently shown us that something cannot come from nothing. This is a direct application of the scientific method to this conclusion. We also know from not only philosophy, but also from science like the astrophysics, the laws of thermodynamics, that the universe had to have a beginning. So we know this to be true, and if that's the case, well, if all of time, space, and matter had a beginning, well, then something outside of time, space, and matter must be the explanation for that creation. This must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. This thing must also be immensely powerful, powerful enough to create everything out of nothing. And this thing must also be personal because it made a choice to create, and only persons can make choices. Now, my atheist friends can call this thing whatever they want, but we Christians call this God. So we do have a reasonable argument to believe in God. Here's another one, the teleological or design argument. It goes like this: the universe appears to be designed, and everything designed has a designer. Therefore, the universe was designed. We know this to be true intuitively, right? There cannot be art without an artist. There cannot be a building without a builder. There cannot be design of any kind without a designer. Unintelligence does not produce intelligence. Science confirms this. Therefore, there must be a powerful intellect behind all the fine-tuning and coding that we see in our cosmos, everything from gravity down to the DNA in our fingertips. It is so precise and so fine-tuned that it would be unreasonable to try to explain it away as mere random chance. I mean, what the atheists are asking us to believe is something akin to an F5 tornado hitting a junkyard and creating a 747 jet. That's what they're asking us to believe. I had a coworker the other day trying to tell me, or not the other day, this was some years ago, but we're in an airport getting ready to go TDY somewhere, and he goes, your Bible, stupid. There's no such thing as a God. Everybody knows that. It's dumb. Christianity's foolish. And I was like, oh, man, David, I'm so glad you're here. I mean, all of us should be so glad that you're here. I mean, because for thousands of years, David, theologians, historians, scientists, and academics of all walks of life have been trying to disprove the Bible, and they've all failed. But you, at 26 years old, here in the Spokane airport, you got it figured out. Man, please, enlighten us. I would love to know, why are you holding this secret from us? And he goes, man, that's stupid. And I go, you're right, David, that is stupid. It's a stupid thing to say. The third argument here is the moral argument, or the objective right and wrong argument. It goes like this: if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But we know objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Usually the rebuttal to this an atheist will have is they'll say something like, oh, what are you saying, that I can't be good because I'm an atheist? No. We're not saying that you can't do good. We're just saying, according to your worldview, there is no such thing as good. There just is. Things just are. As Richard Dawkins would say, it's the meaningless indifference of the world. Nothing means anything. It's all pointless. Now, what's interesting is we don't doubt our sensory intuitions when it comes to the physical world. Like when we can see something, touch something, smell something, taste something, we assume it to be real. So why is it that we doubt our sensory intuitions when it comes to morality? Things that we also know to be true. I mean, who is willing to say, what person do you know is willing to say that abusing a child isn't wrong? Everybody knows it's wrong. And the Bible accounts for this because the law has been written on each of our hearts. This is why no matter what culture you come from or any place you dig back to in history, they all kind of believe like abusing people, murdering people, stealing from people is wrong. They're all making these claims wrong. This is something else I find really interesting about my atheist friends is every person I've ever met believes something isn't right. Like there's just something isn't quite right with the earth. Something just isn't quite right about us as human beings. But that wouldn't make any sense from an atheist worldview. What do you mean right? It just is, right? You can't say it's right or wrong. At least from my paradigm, the Christian worldview, I can account for why things aren't quite right, even though we all believe that. Now, I don't believe that people believe what they say. I believe people believe what they do. And I've never met anybody who lives their lives as if there's no objective morality. I don't even think you could live life like that. Yet, you cannot point to any of the 118 elements on the periodic table and tell me where morality comes from. So they're admitting tacitly that they do believe in the non-material world and they live their lives according to that belief. All right, so these three arguments, they may be sufficient arguments to make the case that there must be a God, but they don't say anything about Christianity. In order to say something about Christianity, we need to examine it for its reliability and see if it can reasonably explain and give an account for the world. So I got 4 questions for you here that if we answer in the affirmative to these, then it would at least make the case that Christianity is at least possible. The first one is, does truth exist? Well, of course it does. If somebody says truth doesn't exist, we just described that as a self-defeating claim. The next one is, does God exist? Well, the principles of deductive reasoning, along with the 3 arguments we just made, would illustrate that's most likely the case. God must exist. Are miracles real? Well, the greatest miracle, the creation miracle, that the entire material universe came from something outside of the material universe, everybody believes in that. We believe in that. The atheists believe in that. So why is it that you don't believe that any of these other miracles are possible? If you believe in the greatest creation miracle, every other miracle recorded in the Bible should be considered at least possible. You know, it's interesting. I was challenging some atheist friends of mine about this the other day. I was making up some story. It's like, yeah, I was sitting at breakfast, and it was pretty busy. Waitress was slammed. She wasn't able to get to our table. And it was really disappointing because I could really use a cup of coffee. But fortunately for me, a cup of coffee just appeared right in front of me on the table. a mug with nice hot coffee in it. And that was really fortunate. It was a lifesaver. And you know what they'll say to you? They'll go, that's stupid. That's impossible. Well, wait a minute. How is that impossible? According to your worldview, everything that exists just popped into existence. And in fact, if there's some law of the universe that enables things just merely popping into existence, then why aren't they popping into existence all the time? Why don't I have things popping into existence in my living room? None of you would accept that claim as being true or reliable. The last question here is the New Testament reliable? Well, you can call it into question, sure, certainly. But the problem that you're going to have is any criteria you would use to try to discredit the Bible could also be used to discredit everything we know about history. There's more evidence to support that Jesus was who he says he was than there is for George Washington. Or like I like to point out, you know how many documents say that your mother is your mother? One. You guys go home for Thanksgiving and hold it up to the light. Like, Mom, I'm going to need some supporting documentation here. You got any other eyewitness accounts? Anybody else who can attest to this being true? The accusation usually goes something like this. Oh, these are just stories made up by men. Well, why would men make up stories? Well, to enrich themselves. What did that happen? They didn't enrich themselves. And they didn't even try to make themselves look good. One of the reasons we tend to believe what the biblical authors are saying is because they don't even omit their own flaws. For example, over and over again, they fail to understand what Jesus is trying to say to them repeatedly. And their leader, Peter, almost drowns due to a lack of faith. He's thick-headed and gets rebuked by Jesus. They fail to stay awake multiple times when Jesus asks them for support. And then their leader goes on to deny Christ 3 times in a single day. And at the end, the men were ultimately off hiding in fear while the women are the ones who went to the tomb to see that it was empty. So if you were fabricating a resurrection story to enrich yourselves and make your lives better, why would you go about depicting yourselves as dim-witted, bumbling, rebuked, lazy, skeptical sissies? Why would you do that? That doesn't seem to make any sense. Also, you certainly wouldn't choose to have women be the ones to go and identify that the tomb was empty and that Christ had resurrected. Why? Because women's testimonies were not considered valid in this day. So just by them putting that in there, they are discrediting their own story by doing it. So what does that lead us to believe? That these guys are probably telling the truth. They're not going out of their way to lie or exaggerate things to make themselves look good. Plus, we know this to be true, that people don't willingly die for things that they know are false. Now, people die for things that are false all the time, but not for things that they know are false. They actually believe them to be true. So the point here is that these early Christians, these biblical authors, they believed that what they saw was real, that Christ did in fact rise from the dead. And they went on their entire lives confessing this and preaching this to any and everybody who would listen. They didn't get rich from it. They got hunted down. They got beaten, they got persecuted, and ultimately martyred for their faith. And if that was true, they would have given the gig up at some point. Like, all right, this is too much. I'm not getting what I thought I was going to get out of this. All right, I didn't see anything. But instead, what we see from early church history is these were the fates of these men. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. Paul was beheaded. James, Jesus' half-brother, was thrown from a cliff and clubbed to death. Thaddeus was martyred by an axe. Matthew was impaled and beheaded. Bartholomew was flayed to death with a whip. Matthew was pierced by a sword and died. Philip was hung upside down by giant hooks and died. James, son of Alphaeus, was crucified. James the apostle was put to death by a sword. Simon was believed to have been crucified, and John was boiled in oil and then imprisoned on an island. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd give it up at some point, right? Once that oil starts boiling, you don't even got to put my feet in it. I'm coming clean. But none of them did, which lends even more credibility to the things that they are claiming to have witnessed. Now, sometimes these, supposed intellectuals will come along and say, well, if you're going to make an extraordinary claim, well, then that would require extraordinary evidence. And these are these kind of wordplay things that sound like they make sense and they're reasonable, but this is actually not true. What is it that you need to prove to validate a resurrection? Well, I need to prove that somebody was alive, that that person died, and that they were alive again after their death. And there's ample evidence to prove each of those three things in regards to Jesus Christ. So to say that you need some weird evidence, some abstract evidence to make that case just isn't true, and you don't hold that standard for anything else that you believe about history. Also, I would say that it's very difficult to account for the explosion of Christianity if the resurrection wasn't true. I want you guys to imagine 1,000 years from now, we got some ancient aliens or Tesla robots doing an archaeological dig on our society. And they come across this story of the Titanic, some of our newspapers and things like that. And they're like, oh, this is interesting. So one of them is saying, hey, I think this ship sank in the Atlantic and all these people died. But then somebody else comes along, a critic, and goes, no, that's not true. That's a fictional story. It's all made up. And you're like, yeah, but I have archaeological evidence that we've unearthed from the ocean. I have written eyewitness accounts and testimonies, people who were there, who witnessed and experienced these events. No, yeah, but those are all bogus. None of those count. And even if I were to grant them those positions, I would then say, well, then how is it that you account for the rapid change in seafaring operations in the Atlantic Ocean? You're saying nothing caused it? Just out of nowhere in history, they increased the amount of life rafts that needed to be on boats, the build quality of these ships, search and rescue techniques changed, maritime communications changed. All of these things just rapidly changed, and you're saying nothing accounts for that? And you're saying my argument is less reasonable than your argument? I don't know. Also, we got thousands of documents written in and around the time of Christ. Not just biblical ones, but extra biblical ones from secular historians. And I'm not going to go through listing all of them off because their names are too difficult to do that with, but there's a lot of them. And if you discredit them, well, then you're discrediting all of history. So when somebody brings this up in a debate to me, I just go, all right, I'll give it to you. We're not going to consider anything from the Bible, but then you can't make any arguments from history at all. I don't want to hear about anything from prior to the 1980s. We're not going to hear it. However, all that being said, I think there is one far more compelling point about Christianity, one far more compelling claim here, and that is that it's possible for you to know God personally. That God is not merely infinite and not personal, as the Hindus and the Buddhists believe, or personal and not infinite, as the Greco-Roman myths would tell us. But God is both infinite and personal. It tells us in Romans 8:16, the Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. The witness of the Holy Spirit is not to be construed as some type of evidence. In fact, I would argue it's not an argument at all. That's not what I'm trying to say here. What I'm saying is that you can know that God exists and you can know that Christianity is true through personal relationship with God. I mean, meet somebody who has had a personal experience with God, and you'll meet somebody who knows God is real, regardless of any evidence or arguments for it. In fact, most of the characters that we read about in the Bible, they came to faith because of a personal encounter, not because of a rational argument. So that's what we should be looking for. Now, just a few weeks ago, we had two individuals come up here and give a testimony, one from Project Hope and one from Saving Grace. And they shared their stories, and they were tragic, stories of hopelessness, abuse, and despair. But they also shared something else, is that when they were down in this pit of life, they cried out to God. They sought after God. And God did what he always does. He met them there. And they were both forever changed because of that encounter with God. They were redeemed and they were restored. And now they've gone on living their lives with peace and purpose and ultimate hope. And on top of that, they've gone out and are now being used by God to make other people's lives better, to bring other people to get to know God, to experience God, and have a relationship with him. So here's my challenge to my atheist friends. Can atheism do that? I mean, I can bring hundreds of people up here on this stage that can give testimony after testimony about how an encounter with God has forever changed their lives. Can you find me even one person who can say that they have found peace, purpose, and hope due to their faith in atheism? It just doesn't bear any fruit. So we must not lose sight of this, though, this key point here. All of this being said is that our primary goal is to win people, not arguments. That's what we're trying to do. My heart is not to tear down another person. My heart instead is to tear down the intellectual barriers that are keeping that person from having a real encounter with God. That if they're struggling with doubt and deception, that they would be willing to go and give the case for Christ an honest review. Give themselves a better chance to have an encounter with God. And I believe that when they do this, everything for them will change. All of a sudden, everything they know to be true in life, they'll be able to give an account for, and it will make sense. And I know I've said this before, but it's just too fitting to not say it again. I love this quote from C.S. Lewis when he was asked, "Why is it that you believe in God?" And C.S. Lewis said, "Well, the reason I believe in God is for the same reasons I believe in the sun, the S-U-N, sun. Not only because I can see it, but because by it, I can see everything else." See, when you come to faith in God and you put on those glasses, that worldview, all of a sudden, not only do you make sense, but everything around you makes sense. So what I want to do is close today by issuing out 2 challenges. One to my atheist friends and one to my Christian brothers and sisters. To my atheist friends, I want to challenge you to be truth-seeking individuals. And on top of that, to have the courage to follow that truth wherever it would take you. Please, whatever you do, do not approach the evidence, do not approach the claims with a conclusion already in mind. That is what it means to be intellectually dishonest. If I show up before ever exploring the evidence, I already have an a priori determination made up in my mind, I'm not being honest. So my challenge to you is to just be honest and give the evidence, give the claims, give the gospel a try, and tell me, after examining it, which worldview gives a better account for what we know to be true. You have to hear me when we say this. We love you. We really, really love you, and we want you to step into a worldview where life has meaning, love is real, and the peace that comes with redemption is possible for every one of you. Now, to my Christian brothers and sisters, I want you to take heart. And I want you to have the courage to challenge doubt and deception. And I want you to realize that there's a fight going on and you need to get involved in the fight. I teach a lot of combatives in the military. And one of the questions I like to ask there is, how many people does it take to fight? And everybody goes, oh, it takes 2 to fight. No, it only takes 1 to fight. And if you don't know how to fight back, then you're just getting your butt kicked. I want us to stop getting our butt kicked. Get into the fight here. We have to realize that we are to love others enough to fight for them. That's what Christ did. And this fight starts right where you're at. Starts in your home, starts in your classroom. It starts at your workplace. I had a coworker the other day say to me, he's like this morally ascendant position. He's like, oh, Dayne, I don't impose my beliefs on my children. I was like, oh, really? Why not? Do you not believe them to be true? Oh, no, I believe them to be true. Oh. Do you believe that they're good? Well, yeah, I believe that they're good. So let me get this straight. You are withholding that which is true and good from your children? I thought you said you love them. So we as Christians, we are called to love others. And so we ought not withhold that which is true and good from them. It tells us in John 13:34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. You see, Christ came to seek and save the lost, Luke 19:10. And we are called the body of Christ, Colossians 1:24. And we have been tasked with carrying on his mission, Matthew 28:19. I believe that it would be accurate to measure the success of a church by how much and how willingly it is in pursuit of seeking and saving the lost. In fact, I would argue that a church that isn't actively trying to seek and save the lost isn't even a church at all. It's merely a Bible study. And who is it that makes up the church? Well, it's you and I. We're the ones who make up the church. So how can we become more effective? Well, we can get into the Word. We can get to know God, because when we do, people will begin to inquire about the peace within you, a peace that surpasses all worldly understanding. The final point I have for you here is to know God is to know peace. Recently, I was watching this interview with John Lennox on it. He's a mathematician, scientist, author, apologist. He wears a lot of hats. Smart guy. And he's being interviewed by some like atheist podcaster guy. I've seen him before, but I don't recognize his name. He's asking John all these types of, why God, why Christianity type of questions. And John's answering them as you would expect. But towards the end of the interview, the guy just sits back in his chair and he goes, John, you've said a lot of things. You've made a lot of really, really good points. But the most powerful thing you've done here today, the thing that's really starting to get me to question my atheism, is just your peace, man. There's a peace about you. I don't get it. Why are you at such ease? And he goes, I've interviewed a handful of Christians in my time doing this, and every one of them has this type of peace. I'm curious about that peace. You see, this is something that I think often gets overlooked, missed when we read 1 Peter 3:15 when it says, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. You see, it presupposes that somebody is asking you the question. So do we know God enough that we are experiencing and exuding a type of peace that would make people curious? Does our peace distinguish us from the rest of the world, or are we wringing our hands with every election and every new sniffle that comes by, and we're worried about money, and we're worried about death, and we're worried about whatever? Do you look any different than the rest of the world? Why would anybody ask you a question about your peace if you're not exuding any? And how can you exude peace if you don't know peace? And how can you know peace if you don't know God? You can't. He is the Prince of Peace. And the last thing here, are we ready, willing, and able to give an account for our worldview when we are asked? So get to know God first so that you can have that peace. And then prepare yourself for people coming and asking about that peace. So today, I want to say, if you're struggling with doubt, what I'd like to do is invite you to consider the words of Jesus himself. In Matthew 7, verse 7 and 8, it says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be open. In a moment, I want you to come down, find somebody to pray with. If you're struggling with doubt at all, some loved ones that are struggling with doubt and with deception, so we can put this doubt to bed and we can have confidence in what we believe to be true as being true, and we can help show other people the light. And may we all collectively seek the truth and seek God together. And the most important thing that I never ever want any of you to forget is that God loves you. He really, really loves you. And that the truth has the power to set you free. So let's seek out the truth. Let's find the truth, and let's be freed by the truth. So if you would, bow your heads with me. Our prayer team will come up here, and please come down and talk to us if you'd like. Father God, thank you for this opportunity to get in front of your children, to speak about what is true, to speak about the hope that we can have in knowing this truth. Thank you for the peace that it gives us, Lord, and help us to do a better job of exuding that peace. Lord, we ask that your Holy Spirit would come and dwell within us and fill us up, to embolden us and empower us to live out a life of faith and a life of peace, that we can be true bearers of the light out in a dark and hopeless world, that we would fulfill the Great Commission, and that we would be good and obedient instruments in your almighty and all-loving hands. Watch over us, Lord. Keep us safe as we travel to and from this week, and bring us back here next week, Lord, with more wins under our belt, Lord, more opportunities for us to share your good news with the lost world. And we give you all the glory for it. In Jesus' name, amen.